So the topic tonight, I'm going to introduce actually by mentioning that tonight's the yahrzeit of my grandmother. I hadn't planned it that way, but that was how it came out. Mindel Wasserboser. And I'll tell you a drop about it because you'll see how it fits into this year. She grew up in a little town in Russia, and when she was a teenager, there were some pogroms that she managed to escape from, hiding in a swamp. And she had an older brother, Shaya, who said to her, "Listen, I'm sick of this. I'm getting out of here. We have someone to sponsor me to go to America. If you want to come with me, come." She was around 14 years old, and she went. And she ended up in the greater Boston area, right, a town called Chelsea, Mass. And what was amazing was, even though she came at that age, and even though the entire trend, especially among the young people, was to leave Jewish observance, she managed to keep it up. And at one point, I usually didn't like homework in school, but they actually gave us this one homework that was very useful. They said, interview a grandparent. I never thought to do it. So I went and I interviewed her about her life. And unfortunately, I lost the cassette, right? That's a separate thing, but at least what I have in here. So I asked her, I said, how did you do it? How did you remain strong, right, in the face of all these things? She said, I credit a lot to a woman called Pestia the Almana. I said, who was Pestia the Almana? She said, Pestia the Almana was a woman in our village. She was a widow, and she was a bit wealthier, had a bigger house than other people. She did two things for me. One thing was she taught me how to read. She taught me how to read Hebrew letters, and we would read the Tzenorena, what they call the Taich Chumash, right? The Chumash with Yiddish Midrashim and everything in there. She said also, when different tzaddikim would come to the town, she had no idea what their names or who they were, they would stay in this woman's house, and people would come there, and she said, she let me sit on the steps in the house and watch what was happening. She didn't know who they were, what it was. That was what she attributed it to. In a very long and difficult life, she herself was widowed at a very young age. A cousin of mine just found her marriage certificate from Boston, and it listed her profession. It said inspector of coats. So I asked my father, what does that mean? He said her job was in a sweatshop. If there were any little threads sticking out, she was supposed to cut them off. So it was an amazing thing, and this brings us somewhat to our topic tonight. Let's start the topic with a letter that was written by Rav Yitzchak Hutner in year 1935. Might help me figure that out. And it was in the years that he was traveling around a bit. Rav Hutner was originally from Warsaw. He went to learn in the Slobodka Yeshiva. He went along when part of the Slobodka Yeshiva went to Hebron. And then he went back to Europe. He spent time in Berlin, eventually back to Israel, then to America. So he was traveling around a lot. And he writes the following letter. He says, Am Yisrael speak about people in terms of a gadol, right? Gedolei Hador. A gadol, somebody like Rav Moshe Feinstein was called a gadol. Now that's kind of interesting because Rav Moshe was under 5 feet tall, right? He didn't have that, but we describe him as a gadol, which means that in our minds, we know that there's some parallel between spiritual greatness and physical largeness, so to speak. We use the same term. But he says sometimes the opposite of gadol can be confusing. Because the simple opposite of gadol in Hebrew is katan, small. But also, when looking at the idea of a gadol as being a person who knows so much, who has so many facets to themselves because they've learned so much, so the opposite of that gadol we'll often call a simple person, a Yehudi Pashut, a simple Jew. Now he says people can end up making the following mistake in the equivalence. Big and small is very different than complex and simple and pashut, right? And you have to erase that English connotation of simple as a simpleton, right, as a person who has no intellect. That's not what pashut means. But he says when you have big and small, there is nothing that the small has that the big doesn't have, and even more. Meaning if I have a small bottle of Coca-Cola and a large bottle of Coca-Cola, there's nothing that the small bottle has that the big one doesn't have. But if we're comparing pashut and murkav, right, the Hebrew word for complex is murkav, meaning different parts that come together. The murkav, the complex person, doesn't have that maila, that wonderful advantage of what's called pashtus, right, to be pashut. And pashut is simplicity, but it means much more. Let's think about the word itself. Lifshot et hayad means to stretch out your hand. This way it's bent, this way it's straight. Someone who's pashut has a straightness to them. They have a strength in that simplicity, which is something that as a person becomes more complex, they can end up losing it if they ever had it. Now, the complexity is wonderful, and we are people that are meant to learn and understand and grow and connect so many things to each other, and that does make us complex. But we must try to get the maila, this advantage of what's called pashtus. Right? He calls it ruchusha hanifla shel pashut, the tremendous possession that a simple person has, which is pashtus. And he says it in certain ways is impossible once a person becomes more complex to be able to be simple in that way. But he says they must learn how to at least access that simplicity. And therefore you must spend time with such Jews, with simple Jews, with what they call the hamon, which again, the English words have such poor connotations. They'll talk about the masses. The masses, when you mention that, it's got a snobby sense to it. But hamon Beis Yisrael is something which is beautiful, the masses of the Jewish people. And he said, you must learn to spend time there. He said, this year, on Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, I'm not going to be with Slobodka, I'm not going to be at this, I'm going to be with simple Jews. And I'm going to try to use that time to soak up the strength of their simplicity. Let's take a look at what this is and how we find it. Rav Hutner obviously isn't negating the fact that we should grow and learn and become more complex, but somehow we're supposed to blend the strength of simplicity with it. Historically, in the Inquisition, when there was the expulsion from Spain, so there was the Chosid Yavitz. The Chosid Yavitz is a famous Perush on Pirkei Avos. He wrote some other Sfarim. In the introduction to one of the Sfarim, he tells his story during the Inquisition, not just his story, but the story of the society in Spain. Again, Jews had been in Spain for centuries. There was what was called the Golden Age, when they were getting along well with everyone. And he said, when the edict went out that you have to convert to Christianity or leave, so he said there were two different reactions in the two different social strata that you found in Spain. He said there was one group of Jews that were more wealthy, more educated, both in Torah subjects and in general subjects, more integrated in Spanish society. And they were the ones who often came up with this idea that we'll just convert on the outside and we'll try to keep Judaism hidden, right? And therefore give us lots of schools for centuries, plays to put on about the Inquisition and the Marranos, etc. He said the simpler people, both in terms of their economic station and in terms of their education, both Jewish and general studies, they simply packed their bags and left. And you would ask them, where are you going? Say, we don't know, wherever we can. So how are you doing it? He said, it's obvious. They said, if you stay here, you have to be Christian. We're not Christian, we're Jewish. He said that was an incredible strength that comes from that simplicity. That's why the simplicity is not something we should treat lightly, look down upon. It's something very deep and very strong. Rav Shach Zatzal used to quote that story and say, you always must maintain a connection to such Jews, right? It's something which is there, what's called the Jewish feeling. The Regesh Yehudi comes from there. And a very strong type of emunah, which is called emunah pshuta, which we'll get to. And again, pashut is not like the English word simple, which is, somewhat denigrating to the idea. So let's try to take a look at how this appears. This idea of Jewish feeling, Jewish regesh, is rooted in something very deep inside of us. Okay? If you want a very powerful example of how a simple concept is much stronger than any complex concept, so this Rav Moshe Shapiro Zatzal, in speaking about Emunah, said the following thing. He said, the most powerful knowledge in your life, which goes beyond any intellectual knowledge, which can never be shaken from you, which doesn't need to be proved to you, is the word ani, I, that I exist. That is our most basic knowledge. It's something we never question, that I exist, and in fact, that I exist somewhere. And in his shiurim, he says that actually from there you can reach the true emunah. The same way that I have emunah in the fact that I exist is also the fact that Hashem exists and that I live in his existence. But just that idea, it's so simple, but it's stronger and deeper than any other concept I have in my life. Every other concept you can argue with me, you can try to prove, you can try to disprove, right? Don't tell me I don't exist. I don't know if you exist, but I certainly exist. That is something which is simple, but it's so strong in its simplicity, it goes beyond any complexity. So let's try to take a look at how it appears in different areas in our life. There's a strange, almost contradiction that we find in the Chumash in a couple of places. Let's take the very dramatic scene where Yosef has his servant put the gavia, put that fancy cup in Binyamin's sack, right, when they're going back to the land of Canaan. And he sends a servant to run after them, and the servant searches and finds it. So the brothers try to defend themselves. And they say like this, they say, Vayomre Elov, Lama yedaber Adoni kadvarim ha'ele. Why is my master saying things like this? Chalila lavadecha me'astoskav davar hazeh. Chalila, Rashi says this word chalila means it's chulin to us, means it's profane to us, it's yuck, it's gross, it's we don't do that kind of thing. Steal? Us? And then they go on to give what the Torah describes as one of the first Kal V'chomers, a very logical explanation. He said, Hein kesef asher matzonu b'fi amtechoseinu. Say, listen, we found our money that we paid for the food on our last trip, we found that back in our luggage. And we brought it back to you. We came back now and we said, somehow our money came back to us, please take it. So if we brought you back that money, how could it be that we're going to steal from your master's house any silver or gold? A kal v'chomer, a beautiful, logical explanation. So what was that first bit with the Chalila? So this I heard the Talmud Rebbe Shlita explained. He said that is an example, and that's what Rashi's saying with this idea of chulin hulanu. That's coming from a place that's beyond the logic of, certainly doesn't make sense that we would steal from your master. It was this drawing back at the very concept that we would steal. It's this recoil which comes from the fact that my identity contradicts that behavior entirely. We find a similar thing with Yosef and Eshes Potiphar, where it first says, Vayima'en, he refused. And then he gives an explanation. He says, right, your husband put me in charge of everything in the house. How could I do such a thing to him? What is that Vayima'en? That is that first natural reaction, that Regesh Yehudi, that Jewish feel from something that isn't us. And it's an important thing to have and develop, but you have to take it in the right way. Let's try to see how this fits in with a fascinating medrash. In the Sifra, right, one of the midrashim, this is on the pasuk that I had, sorry. Anyway, the pasuk is, you can all look it up in your computers, Vavdil eschem min ha'amim lios li. Hashem says, I separated you from the nations to be mine. Now he says, what does that mean? Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah says the following. He says, Minayin shelo yomer odom ef shilu bo shatnez. Okay, we're not supposed to wear shatnez. We're not supposed to wear a combination of wool and linen. Usually not a terrible thing that we have to fight. Or to say, ef shilecho basar chazir. I wouldn't want to eat pig. Right? That must taste disgusting. Pigs eat garbage. They must taste like garbage. Ef shilava ala erva. I wouldn't want to have forbidden relations. But what should a person say? Efshi. I would want to do those things. Uma ese. But what can I do? Va'avisha b'shamayim gazar laikach. Hashem decreed that I can't do those things. So how does that fit together with that chalila? Meaning, Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah is teaching us a very important thing. Don't lie. Don't lie to yourself. Don't lie to your children. Don't lie to your community. If you start telling people, Hashem protected us from eating pork because it tastes horrible, and save you from getting trichinosis because if the pork isn't cooked the right way, you can get this terrible intestinal disease or something like this. And they're going to say billions of Goyim start their day with bacon, move on to ham for lunch and pork for supper, and they seem to enjoy it greatly. It must taste very good. Why are you telling me it tastes horrible? That's not true. But I'm supposed to say, of course it would taste good, but it's not for me. Hashem said that isn't for me, and therefore I recognize that, but I don't want to do something that's not for me. I'll just tell you parenthetically, I heard such a nice thing from Yitzhak David Grossman, the Rav of Migdal HaEmek, a very famous person who spread a lot of Torah in that area of Israel. And he said he was once on a plane. He traveled a lot for fundraising, and the flight attendant came by, and she brought him his kosher meal. And she said, I can see that you're a rabbi. I'm also Jewish, and I work for the airline. I've been handing out these meals. I really don't understand. What is kosher? So he said to her, first, he did a clever thing. He says, where do you live? First of all, he says, because we're not going to have much time to really talk this through. Right before I go, I'll connect you to somebody in your neighborhood you can learn more with. But I'll just ask you this. What kind of car do you have? She said, I don't know. I have a Honda Accord or something. I said, what type of gas do you put in it? She says, I don't know. Regular gas from the gas station. He says, why don't you put in diesel fuel like the trucks use? Why don't you put in jet fuel like we're using right now? She said, I don't know. I guess it would be bad for the engine. He says, that's what kosher food is. You have a different engine than other people. And therefore, you have to know which fuel is yours and which fuel isn't yours. But that doesn't mean that their fuel doesn't taste good. And it's ridiculous to say so. But then how is a person supposed to get the reaction of Chalila when it comes? In other words, it is a healthy Jewish reaction that if somebody offers you a cheeseburger, that you recoil, right? Why? And you're not supposed to be going around sniffing, oh, that looks really good. How do you make it? That's a very dangerous way to live. So how do you combine the two? So let's think about someone who has an allergy, like peanut allergy. They say kids in Israel are very protected against it because they eat bamba from nearly birth. Okay, it has peanuts in it. But if a person has peanut allergy and they come over to your house, you say, oh, come, I just made a peanut butter and jelly sandwich. And they go, no. Say, what did I do? I'm just offering you a peanut butter and jelly sandwich. You hate peanut butter? Right? Disgusting. He says, no, I'm sure it tastes very good, but it's very dangerous to me. With my allergy, that could kill me. Okay, so that understanding of who we are and how we are is very clear. I'll tell you a fascinating connection to this. I heard a lecture by an Israeli professor who did his PhD work on Jewish themes in American comic books. Okay, you can get a PhD in anything. And it is very interesting because the comic books in America were started by Jewish immigrants, right, that came there. And especially the first, most popular one, Superman, was written by Jewish people. And if you look at the themes in there, you find many Jewish type themes which are there. Idea of Superman coming from this other planet in a little spaceship, supposedly like Moshe Rabbeinu and the Teva, etc. But and Superman being someone who looks like a poor schnook on the outside, but really has tremendous powers inside, which is again part of the Jew going through history, looked down upon from the outside. And then he added in this little knetch, that there's this substance called kryptonite. And if Superman gets near this substance, touches this substance, he loses all of his powers. That's also a Jewish theme, just like the idea of kashrus. That idea that because we are special, because we are different, there are certain things that affect us in certain ways. And if our destiny is that important to us, so then we recoil without having to come to foolish and childish explanations of saying that it's not good and it's not healthy and it doesn't taste good, etc. So that's a combination that we can have of the simplicity of that Jewish regesh, what they call in Yiddish the gefühl, that a person feels about things that are antithetical to us, while also maintaining the understanding and the complexity and the truth of what and why these things come from. Let's move on to some other examples of this. Simplicity does not mean simplistic, superficial, or narrow. We know that one of the different ways in which we read the Torah is the level which is called pshat, okay? Often translated as the simple meaning. That doesn't mean, chas v'sholom, that it's inaccurate or that it's a superficial reading of the Torah. It is one level, and in fact, all the other levels are included in the pshat. And in fact, pshat should not be confused with a literal reading of words. I heard this from Rav Nevin Salshli to the Rav of the Old City in Yerushalayim. He said the following. We find Rashi brings two perushim from Chazal when it says, Vayishkav Ruvain is Bilha, right? That Ruvain literally slept with Bilha, right? The servant who Rachel brought into the marriage. And Chazal said, some say it's as it's written. Some say that he moved Yaakov's tent, right, to Bilhah's tent after Rachel died. And they bring a proof to that also because when Moshe Rabbeinu, I'm getting wrong, when Yaakov Avinu giving the bracha speaks about that, he refers to the idea of changing the beds, changing yitzuai, right, the bed clothes, etc. So Rav Nevin Sal said he hears people often say, okay, it's clear what the pshat is. It says black and white in the pasuk. Chazal tried to do some apologetics and to, dress it up and do things, and they came up with this alternate allegorical kind of way of reading it. But he said that's not true, because a pshat isn't taking one sentence and reading the sentence and translating it. Pshat of any document means I have to look at it in context of the entire thing. We have to look at how Reuven is related to throughout the continuation in Chumash and see these things, and then you'll see that perush by Chazal that he moved the bed is much more pshat than the other one. Okay, so this idea of pshat doesn't mean something which is superficial or narrow. It means seeing things, right, as they're written, but in the context of the whole document, which is a very deep thing to do. Rav Chaim Soloveitchik, a famous story that before Pesach, he was sitting with Talmidim, a woman came to him, she said, Rabbi, can I use milk for the Arba Kosas? And he said, no, I'm sorry, you can't. And he gave her a large amount of money. So after she walked away, the Talmidim said, we understand why you gave her money, that she should buy wine because she can't use milk for the Arba Kosas. Why'd you give her so much money? So he says, think, if she was thinking of using milk for the Arba Kosas, that means she has no meat or chicken for the Yontif Sudas either. So some people described it as Rav Chaim's genius. It's not so much genius as seeing the whole pshat, meaning not seeing it narrow, right? That's part of the problem sometimes. People like to ask shailas to either anonymous rabbis or now to AI, and you'll say, can I do this? Can I do that? That AI is not going to give you money for your Pesach Seder if you ask, can I use milk for the Arba Kosas? It's able to access the data that it has to be wine and tell you that, okay? But it doesn't have that perspective. That's a pashtus, right? That's not something which is so complex, but it's true pshat in which you see these things. So now let's move to the other side of the complexity of Torah, okay? With all the strength of Emunah Pshuta and coming to Judaism with that straight, clear clarity that this is for me and other things are not for me and I know who I am, learning Torah is the most complex thing in the world. It never ends. Our greatest scholars are called Talmidei Chachamim. If you interview any of them at the last days of their life, have you finished all the Torah, all the material? They'll say, I just scratched the surface. I'm just beginning. It's incredible, and things relate from one to the other, and the principles transfer from one to the other. It's incredibly complex. And that actually adds to Emunah Pshuta. Let's explain how. The Kuzari, right, was written by Rabbi Yehuda Halevi in the Middle Ages. It was his kind of polemic to explain Judaism, but he wrote it in a very interesting form based on a historical event, the King of the Khazars, in the steppes of Russia there, the Asian part, interviewed Christians, Muslims, people who followed Greek philosophy, and eventually the Jewish Chacham was kind of last resort to see what religion he should follow. And there, the book really goes into the discussions, the dialogue, the questions and answers. So one fascinating question that the king asks the Chacham, he says, tell me, how did you develop this religion? It is like so detailed and so complex, right? How did you do it? How long did it take? And he answers him, he says, didn't. He said, one day it wasn't here. The next day it was there. We didn't have the Torah, and Hashem gave us the Torah. He said, can you imagine that people could come up with something like this? Can you imagine the Jews would make a committee to decide all the arguments? Should tefillin be black? Should they be green? Should they be round? Should they be square? All these things. He says the very complexity of Torah screams this. Mike mentioned Maseches Zvachim. The Daf Yomi now is in the Seder of Kodshim, what's called, which deals with all the laws of the Korbanos. Right? Korbanos are a tricky concept for us for sure, and that may be a future shir at some point to try, because many people, when they hit Sefer Vayikra, and there's so many details about Korbanos. But Rabbi Yehuda Levi says, if you look at that world, that entire Seder Kodshim, it is incredibly, incredibly complex. And even if a person says, well, nations around the world have this concept of a sacrifice, the details in every korban, is it a lamb? Is it a goat? Is it a bird? How old is it? Where is it shechted? Right? What comes with it? What thoughts have to be had? What is done on the south side of the Mizbeach? What is done on the north side of the Mizbeach? When does it have to be done over? That's just scratching the surface of it. He says that cries out the divine design of it. No human being could, and no human being would want to come up with a system that detailed like that. It makes no sense. So the very complexity of Torah simply strengthens that emunah pshuta. I'll tell you a fascinating example where it happened. People have heard about Rav Uri Zohar, right? Zichron Livracha. Uri Zohar was in the 50s, 60s, 70s in Israel, the media superstar. He produced famous movies, comedies. He had a show on TV in Israel. Somebody who was around at the time told me the streets were like Yom Kippur when Uri Zohar's show was on. Nobody was out. Everybody was watching. In the 1970s, he started, through some friends of his, having some very serious discussions with a very special Rav, this Rav Zilberman, who founded that community that's now in the Old City. And he decided that he wants to keep Torah. And this brought him on a whole and very interesting journey for the rest of his life. But one time when he told the story, he told an aspect that I hadn't heard before. He said, part of the problem was I was married at the time. And my wife had grown up in the very non-religious, anti-religious youth movements like I had, but she didn't have all those discussions. She was not on that same trip. He said, at the time, we were living in a beautiful house in Yafo by the ocean, and we had a very serious discussion one night. Could we stay married? It boiled down to, would she agree to keep the basic halachas of a Jewish home, just the minimum, so that we could stay married? And we talked and talked, and the decision seemed to be that she couldn't, and we would have to break up. So he said, he walked upstairs, very sad. As he was walking upstairs, he turned down to look toward his wife. He had just recently started buying some Jewish Sfarim, Torah books. He bought a set of the Rambam. He saw his wife reach out, take out a volume of the Rambam. The next day, he slept a little. He came down. His wife was waiting for him. Doesn't know if she slept or not. She said, I can do it. I'm with you. He said he wanted to know what changed her mind, what she read in the Rambam. He said, I was too scared to mess with it. Right? He says, I didn't want to start making problems. It's like, whatever, I've had this tendonitis in my foot recently, so it got better, Baruch Hashem, and I asked the physical therapist, should I be doing some exercises to strengthen it? He said, your tendon is like a woman who was angry with you. He says, don't start asking, so what really made you so angry? He says, leave it alone. So here, he left it alone, but he said, a few months later, he said, I have to ask you. I have to ask you, remember the night we had that discussion? And I saw you take out the Rambam. Next morning, you told me. What did you see? So she said to him in Hebrew, she said, Tamin li lo hivanti milah. She said, believe me, I didn't understand the word that I saw in that book. Aval ra'iti shezer etzini. I saw that it was serious. Meaning, I wasn't going to change my whole life for a bunch of baba mices, of tradition, as Fiddler in the Roof taught us, or things like that. But here I saw the Rambam is formulating all these things. There are these commentaries on the side that are questioning and answering and sources and cross-references. She said, that I can deal with. That I can do and I can learn. And they went on that journey together for many, many years. So that's how the complexity can help us maintain that strength. Let's look at things that demand complexity and that really don't allow us to remain, so to speak, that simple Jew if it means not learning to look at things in depth. We have to maintain the strength of the simplicity, but let's take a look. First of all, one action that we do is never black and white. Okay? The dangerous side of simplicity is to look at things as black or white, good or bad. Why? Because things are complex. Yerovam ben Nevat was the first king of the kingdom of Israel when it split off after from Rechavam, Shlomo's son. And it says in the Gemara that he was rewarded for something that he did. He chastised Shlomo HaMelech. When Shlomo HaMelech married the daughter of Paro, he chastised him for using taxes. Who were there to make things for her. And he was rewarded for that. It's a very brave thing to do. Oh, thank you very much. It's a very brave thing to do to chastise the king. And it says, but he was also punished for that. Why was he punished? Because he chastised him publicly. Same action. On part of it he's rewarded, on part of it not. The Mesilas Yesharim says that when a person examines their own actions, he says there's a certain way of doing it, which is called the mashmish. It's a fun word to say, mishmush. What does that mean? He says like a person who's checking fabric. You make this motion with your hands, you feel it. Is it strong? Is it really wool? Is it synthetic? What is it? He says the same thing. It could be you did something good, but it also had a side in it that wasn't so good. You decided to make a wonderful Hanukkah party that would go all night, right, and invite kids from the neighborhood and do a whole thing, but you woke up half the building at 2:00 in the morning. So on one hand, there was a very beautiful thing you did. On the other hand, it had a negative part as well. So we have to be careful with that to realize that each thing can be complex. Our relationship to other Jews has to be complex. Listen to an example from the halachas of Shmiras Haloshen, right? Of what we're allowed to say and not allowed to say. If Mike comes over to me and tells me, just when you leave, be careful. One of the people here was very insulted, and he said he wants to beat you up, if he can get you alone after the shir. Which guy is it? That one. Okay, thank you. Now, he's telling me something negative about a person. That's not a nice thing to want to beat me up. Am I allowed to believe that that's true? No. I'm not allowed to believe that as a fact. But I am obligated to be choshesh, to suspect that it may be true, and to take steps to protect myself. So I may make sure that I'm not alone with him. But then, at the same time, if he comes over to me and he says, I'm sorry, I need to buy something for Shabbos. I just don't have any change. Could you lend me 100 shekel? So if I have the money to lend, it's a mitzvah to lend another Jew. If you're able to lend him, he has what's called the cheskas kashrus. As far as I'm concerned, he is a kosher Jew. But he said maybe he does want to beat me up. That's why I'm being very careful around him. But he's also a Jew who needs 100 shekel. And I'm obligated to treat him just like I would any other Jew. That demands complexity of us. The beautiful story about the Chofetz Chaim was told by Rabbi Lopian. Rabbi Lopian was a Talmid of Kelm, who had a yeshiva in Russia. Later he spent time in England and eventually was the Mashgiach in Kfar Hasidim here in outside Haifa. Now, he told the story of the time when he had this yeshiva in Russia. At the time, the communists had already come to power. And the communists assigned to Jews who were communists the job of wiping out Judaism. They wanted to wipe out religion in general. It was the opiate of the masses. And Jews know better how to attack Judaism than anybody else. And here he was in a town in which the mayor was a Jew and a Communist Party member. But the mayor never gave them any problems. He was so curious. At one point he got together with the mayor. He said, I have to ask you, you're a communist official. I really appreciate you've been treating the yeshiva okay. I'm just curious why. He said, I'll tell you my story. He said, I was a talented young man. And when I was a teenager, my parents wanted to send me to yeshiva. I was good at learning. So they sent me to Radin. Radin was the town where the Chofetz Chaim lived. He founded the yeshiva there. And I came in to be tested, the Chofetz Chaim's son-in-law. So he asked me what Gemara I was learning. He tested me. I did well. But I wanted to be very honest. I said, Rebbe, I want to be totally straight and upfront with you. I'm a member of the Communist Party. I believe in communism. and I think it can really help and save the world. And I didn't want to come here under false pretenses. He said, okay, this is not a decision I can make. I think you have to speak to my father-in-law, to the Chavetz Chaim. So he said, he sat me down across from the Chavetz Chaim. And once again, I told him what I said. And the Chavetz Chaim said, I'm sorry, we can't have you in the yeshiva. Because someone who believes in communism, to the extent that you do, would try to convert the entire yeshiva to communism. Right? Those things were happening in yeshivas at the time. So he said, I told the Chavetz Chaim, I'm totally fine with that. I was honest with you. You're honest with me. I even understand you. I just have one problem. There are no trains out of Radin tonight. What am I going to do? So the Chavetz Chaim said, you'll come to me. And he brought me home. He made me suffer. And he set a bed for me. And in the middle of the night, I woke up because I sensed someone was like creeping in the room. And I opened my eyes, the crack was the Chavetz Chaim. And he took another blanket and he put it on me because he was afraid I was cold. So that is the beauty of the complexity in terms of our midos, our attributes, our interactions with people. On one hand, the Chavetz Chaim was telling him, you cannot enter my yeshiva. You are a danger to my yeshiva. On the other hand, you're my fellow Jew. You need a place to eat. You need a place to sleep. Join me. I want to make sure that you're warm. We're too simplistic in terms of labeling people as good or bad, for us, against us, black or white. The world isn't like that. The Torah isn't like that. And we certainly are differently. Sometimes, and we'll finish with this, I guess, we confuse ourselves in terms of our own complexity. We don't understand ourselves. We don't know who we are because we feel so many opposing emotions or hear a different language. And this is part of our heritage. Listen to the following. There's a pasuk in Tilim, Ayin Ches. It says, "Vayechazbu v'fihem v'liba lo nachon imo." They tricked him with their mouths, and their hearts were not true to him. Who's this talking about? Right? Oh, sorry, it finishes. V'lo nemnu bibriso, and they were not loyal to his covenant. It says in the Tosefta. What is this talking about? When Am Yisrael was standing on Har Sinai, and they were saying, Nasev Ishma, Bikshu Lignov Das El Yonah. They tried to trick HaKadosh Baruch Hu, so to speak. Genevas Das is when you steal someone's mind, you try to convince them of something that's not really true. Right? And it says, it looks also from the Psukim that it worked. Because on one hand, Hashem said, I hope that they will always be like this in the future. The Medrash says that every Jew had angels that came and gave them a crown, one for Nasa, one for Nishma. But it says that they were tricking him. Why were they tricking him? Shmos Rabbah, it says they were standing on Har Sinai saying Nasa v'Nishma, but in their heart they were thinking about doing idolatry. How do we know? Take a look. A few psukim later, they made the egel, they made the golden calf. So how does that fit with the Nasa v'Nishma? And if it wasn't true, if it was false, if it was superficial, why did HaKadosh Baruch Hu reward them? Why do we still celebrate Shavuos on the day of that first Matan Torah when those luchos had to be broken because of the Cheta Egel? So the answer, I heard again from the Talmud Rebbe, is the following. We have so many deep levels inside of us. The Sfarim described that the depth of the nefesh of a person is unfathomable. So therefore, we can have both things going on inside of us at the same time. There was definitely a part of them that was really sincere and really wanted to follow the Torah no matter what. But they also had inside of themselves something that didn't. That doesn't cancel all of it. That doesn't take away the beauty of that part of them that they put into it that was really true and really sincere. HaKadosh Baruch Hu knew the truth. He knew the future. But he knew the beauty and the wisdom of that. That's why we have to believe in ourselves. Sometimes when we see to contradict ourselves, we seem to, the Kotzker Rebbe used to phrase that it mentions a menuta malach, a menuta galach. A human being is one day he's an angel, the next day he's like a priest of Avodah Zarah. Right? We flip back and forth. He says, don't let it make you believe that the good things inside of you aren't legitimate, aren't real. And the deep, deep, deep in the bottom, that's the true you. Because as we say every day, Neshama shenasata v'tahara, and Neshama you gave me is pure. So this is the combination of simplicity and complexity. You can trace it throughout all our avoda. And I'm happy to hear from people as they find more examples and see it. But this combination is part of who we are. We must not oversimplify. We must not treat people and situations superficially. We must learn to look deep. On the other hand, we can't let that complexity weaken the strength of that simple emunah pshuta of a Jew. Baal Shem Tov used to say, he said, after everything I've achieved, I come back to emunah pshuta. That's what we're looking for. Wishing you all a wonderful night and continued success here in the Kehillah.